This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Pleasure today to introduce two of my most esteemed colleagues at Emory who are about to have a conversation about art in India. Dr. Deepika Bahri and Sir Salman Rushdie. Professor Bahri focuses her research on post-colonial literature, culture, and theory. She is the author of Native Intelligence, Aesthetics, Politics, and Post-Colonial Literature, and co-editor of Between the Lines, South Asians and Post-Coloniality and Realms of Rhetoric. She brings also a nuanced interpretation of Salman Rushdie's writing through her work. In fact, as many of people here in the audience had an opportunity to experience, she served as a curator for the remarkable exhibition on Salman Rushdie's archive, which is housed at Emory's Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library. This archive, significant portions of which are open to the public, contains the celebrated writer's computer files, private journals, notebooks, photographs, and manuscripts, providing insight into his creative process, his commitment to human rights, his email traffic, and his wide-ranging intellectual interests. As University Distinguished Professor at Emory, Salman Rushdie teaches, presents public lectures, and engages with the academic community on campus in forums such as this one. His insights on topics from film to memoir, from literature to politics, from Mumbai to Atlanta, enrich all of our lives. We consider him to be our friend, fellow faculty member, and among the greatest writers of our time. Thus, we're most fortunate to have Professors Bahri and Rushdie as intellectual guides on today's conversational topic, art in India. Thank you very much for being here.
So here we are, Salman. You've made it. You've reached the summit.
You know, I knew if I just kept struggling away, one day this moment would come.
Here we are. Right, I'm going to start by taking issue with Salman here. This is going to
I haven't
center.
said anything yet.
Well, you've been saying things for a while here. I'm going to take issue with something you said yesterday.
Okay.
And this is going to center around what we call in India the Paisa Vasool issue, which is a celebrated Indian preoccupation with getting their money's worth. Yesterday, you said that, answers are to a penny. Everybody's happy to give an answer. And I'm going to say we'll have to redo the math here because I've got those 2 paisa questions for you. You're going to have to come up with the answers and give the audience their money's worth.
Do I get paid?
You should. Where's the check writer?
No. Okay, it's all right. Yes, okay.
Well, so because I'm warning you, very obvious 2 paisa worth questions. So the first one, the most obvious one, what is Indian art? As in, what makes it Indian? What makes it art?
Are we talking about visual arts? Are we talking about what?
You choose.
Well, if we talk about visual art, why not? I think for contemporary Indian artists, there's a double problem. One is the enormous burden of the Indian artistic tradition. That you have this thousands of years of extraordinary work both in painting and sculpture. And it can be crippling, and it can also have the problem of excessive influence. That you go on trying to make versions of what has been done so well, before. And it's difficult to find a contemporary language that recognizes that but moves on from it. I think the other problem is the enormous power of influence both of Western art and of the Western art market. I think what's happening increasingly is that the things that are seen as successful and saleable in Western galleries and sale rooms are beginning to, again, over-determine what is being done in India. You know, I know of a number of artists who I think of as very good painters, who have more or less stopped painting because painting is unfashionable, and have begun to make installation work, because installation work is what's fashionable.
Oh, one of them is a very good friend of yours, Vivan Sundar.
Vivan is somebody I have this argument with him all the time. I say, no, he's a beautiful painter, luminous painter. And now he makes these installations, which are, they're interesting, but I feel that maybe 60 or 70 people could make those installations, and only one person can make his paintings. And I feel it's a loss, But I believe not just Vivan, but in this younger generation, which is now becoming so successful in the international art market, the kind of Subodh Gupta, etc. generation, they're very much tuned into, what the Gagosian Gallery wants, etc. And whereas, like, if you like, the generation older than myself, the Hussain generation, Hussain, Raza, Gaitonde, that generation, there you find the overdetermined influence of the modernist movement in Europe. So, Hussein's famous horses are very much echoes of Picasso's Guernica, and you can see that they are over-influenced by it. And when you look at a lot of the abstraction of S.H. Raza, you see strong echoes of European abstraction of the modernist period, and you feel it's too much mimicry, and too little added to it. And so
you're saying Indian art, at least modern Indian art, is very much in conversation with global trends.
Yeah, and has had a real problem of how to make an actual Indian art. What I feel is that in between those generations, between the Hussain generation and the Subodh Gupta generation, there's this middle generation of artists who actually were quite successful at doing that. The generation of artists like Bhupen Khakar and Arpita Singh and Nalini Malani and Nilima Sheikh and Ghulam Sheikh and so on. These artists, I think, did make an art which felt contemporary and not derivative. And the way they did it, I think, was first of all to recognize certain things that are at the heart of the Indian artistic tradition, which is that it's very prominently figurative, not abstract. The human figure is almost always present. And the second thing is that it's very often narrative. A lot of South Indian Kerala paintings, you will often see the figure of a god or a hero appearing 2 or 3 times within the same painting, as a story is being told. And so what these artists did was to take those 2 ideas of narrative art and figurative art and put that at the center, and then unite that with, if you like, the pop visual art tradition of India. Painted trucks, painted stores, painted movie posters. Everything is painted in India. So you walk out in the street, you see a lot of painting.
M.F. Hussain was a Bollywood painter.
So you take that tradition, if you could like, of a kind of Indian pop art, and you associate it with these ideas of figuration and narration from classical art. And you put those together, and that became to me a very interesting body of work. So that middle generation, if you look at the last 3 generations, I think that middle generation is the one which, to my mind, did establish some kind of something that you could call a modern Indian art, that was neither too much in debt to European modernism, nor too much trying to pander to Western art market. So that's, if you like, something that it seems to me has happened in the visual arts.
What's changed, and when did things change? What's happened since the middle generation? Are there some markers we should look at? The 2005 Edge of Desire, Global, New York, where was it? New York, Tokyo. Exhibition on the sale of Taib Mehta's Mahishasur for 1.5 million.
Yeah, but it's entirely to do with money. It's entirely to do with money. There's as recently as the late 80s, Indian art commanded tiny prices outside India. And at a certain point, people began to look at Indian art, and that some of that has to do with the Indian diaspora. Some of it has to do with the success of the diaspora in places like Silicon Valley. People who don't, not going back to India very much, who want a bit of India to hang on the wall. And that drove the prices of Indian art up. It added several zeros to the end, and then that immediately interested galleries, etc., and so the thing began. So it's very price-led. The shift into this new phase of, the way it's good, but Indian art has this big international audience, or enlarging international audience. In a way, it's damaging because the desire to make work that's appealing to that audience is beginning, I think, sometimes to get in the way.
So what's hanging on your walls?
Well, I've been fortunate in my life in that I've known a lot of that middle generation of artists they're talking about. I mean, I've known a lot of them as friends, and even some of the older people. I mean, like Hussain Saab. I mean, I knew a little bit. So I have some of the work of the artists that I've known, really, and one or two that I haven't. I have, I have one Hussain, and which actually is not mine. It was done as a gift for my now 15-year-old son. Mm-hmm. So I just, who managed to charm Hussain into doing a picture for him. And I said, well, you just paid for your college education. So
this is not one of horses, I take it?
There's a horse.
There's a horse. It's a horse of a different color.
Yeah, there's always a horse. It's, Hussain could do horses in his sleep, could. I have some, and Bhupen Kakar was a very close friend of mine, and so I have...
he's done that fabulous portrait of you.
Of me, yeah, which, I'm very proud of it because it's the first, I think, and only painting by an Indian artist to be in the National Portrait Gallery in England.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. It was actually not commissioned by the gallery, it was commissioned by the BBC, who were making a program about the Moor's Last Sigh. And if you look at the painting, it has a lot of, it's got me in the middle, but it's got a lot of little scenes from the novel all around the edge. And after it was finished, it was offered to the Portrait Gallery, and they said that they wanted it.
Snapped it up. Well, since you mentioned the Moor's Last Sigh, several of your novels actually do feature different sorts of artist figures. But the Moor's Last Sigh, most prominently probably, gives us almost a history of modern Indian art.
It's an untrustworthy history because because it's a fictive history. And I, of course, had to do this thing about inserting at least two fictional artists into the his actual history of Indian art. So in order to do that, you have to make space, so you have to somewhat deform the previously existing history.
So you're willing to talk about that a little bit? Aurora is a larger-than-life figure on the art scene in India in this novel.
Well, the thing that gave me permission to make Aurora was the actually existing figure of Amrita Shergill, actually, Vivan Sundaram's aunt, actually. Half Indian, half Hungarian painter, was dead at the age of 28. For reasons that nobody is entirely certain, because she was, if you look at her correspondence, Ivan's just edited a big volume of her letters and so on. Like literally 2 days before she died, she was making arrangements to have dinner with people and to meet people, and she seemed to be completely in the pink of health, and then suddenly, boom. So it seems as if it may have been something like a ruptured appendix or something, but nobody is quite certain. But she died very suddenly. At the age of 28, leaving behind a body of work which is, it's good, but it's sort of a first movement. You really don't really know what that art would have been as she matured and grew and so on. And that gave me permission to make up some of it. Because Amrita is quite like Aurora in one regard, in that they were both very bohemian characters. They were very nonconformist. Amrita was a great disappointment to her very severe father. And she went to Europe, she consorted with painters of the period, she had a number of affairs, including more than one lesbian affair. And all of this is very shocking, in an Indian context. And so she was a kind of outrageous figure. And that allowed me to make up. I mean, Aurora is in many ways not like her, but they have outrageousness in common.
Well, you said you actually kept yourself from learning too much about
Amrita until afterwards.
Until after you finished writing.
Yeah, because I didn't want to just make a portrait. But it's certainly the fact that there was a major Indian woman artist at that time gave me, if you like, permission to make one up. But Aurora actually dies young in the book, not as young as that, but she has a longer career, and by far the hardest thing in making up that book was to work out what her paintings would look like, and by the time I'd finished, I felt that I could paint them. That if I felt frustrated not to have the gift, because I thought if I just, if I knew how to use the brush and make these marks on canvas, I actually know exactly what those pictures are supposed to look like. And I still do, and I still have them in my head. So
somebody needs to do those.
Well, somebody has to, find a way of plugging into my brain. But
technology is developing.
Yeah, really. Yeah, I'll be the first in line to have something plugged into my brain. That's absolutely what I want to do. But so I think again the fact that I knew personally so many of the Indian artists who were my contemporaries also kind of gave me the courage to try and make one up, because I've talked to them a lot about their work and how they felt and so on. And so the book did come out of a kind of long period of engagement with Indian painters.
So you could almost read the novel as a very loose sort of roman à clef. They're actually figures, Shukumar Sen, sort of a Satyajit Ray, that sort of.
Yes. There was obviously a sense of trying to create an artistic milieu in India which is an echo of the actual artistic milieu. But those characters who are developed to any degree, are very much, their own. I mean, they're fictional characters. They're not really modeled on anyone.
So, well, if I stayed within the fictional world, there's also a credo for the kind of art that Aurora thinks is required at different moments in Indian history.
Yeah.
And at one point, you talk about Aurora's dislike for the purely mimetic. And there's a suggestion that epic fabulism is more appropriate as a vehicle.
How surprising that I would say that.
Surprise, surprise.
There's a sense in which you talk about another artist's ideas about art. You find yourself using your own ideas about art and putting them in there in order to bring...
We would never have guessed.
You'd never get... But and it's kind of interesting to do it when you're transferring media. When you're not coming out of... You're taking ideas that I've used in the written form, and you're trying to understand what those ideas might be if applied to a visual form. What would be the visual equivalent? And I remember one of the reasons that Bhupen Khakar and I became close is that when we first were getting to know each other, there was a point when he said to me something like, he said, "When I read your stories, I see my pictures." And I had a similar feeling. I said to him, when I see your pictures, I see, I can see my stories there. And so we had that immediate sense that there was some echo, And I tell you this story about how I first got one of his pictures, because it's a nice story. Bhupen was being shown by quite a posh gallery in London at the time, the Casmin Knoedler Gallery, so the prices were already, And I just starting out as a writer, I really didn't have that much cash. He had a show and said, he said, just come and see the pictures and we'll go and have lunch. So, and as it happened, on the day that I was going to meet him, I had sold a short story for the first time to an American magazine for what at that time I thought of as serious money, which was, $2,500, something, And as it happened, the check arrived that morning and I had it in my pocket. And so then I went to meet him, and there was this one particular picture, second-class railway compartment, which I liked very much. And I said to him, and this shows you how cheap it was in those days, I said to him, I know I can't afford it, but just to ask how much that cost. And we asked, and the price of the picture was exactly the same figure as the check in my pocket. and then I thought, there's something kind of beautiful about turning my story into his picture. So I wrote the check and I have the picture. I'm very proud of it. It's one of the best pictures I've got. And God knows what it's worth now, because Bhupen now, of course, is a big figure.
Indeed. I was going to ask you about the relationship between the different arts. And at some point, just again, ask the basic question, how do we define art? And I think for most of us, we go first to thinking of visual arts. And not so much film or literature or whatever. But, it could be this. How should we talk about art? I mean, for you, there's so much mixture and hybridity in your
I don't
work.
make the distinction, I mean, I think the artistic spirit is what it is, and it finds the outlet most appropriate to it. But I don't think there's really, in terms of what people are doing as artists in film or art or literature. I mean, of course, there's differences in execution, but I think the sensibilities, etc., they're very closely related. I mean, it's very easy to talk to artists across disciplines, because you feel that you easily have a language in common. There are differences in the language because, for example, music has a very particular language which can often be very difficult for non-musical people to have access to, and art also, visual art, has a particular language. But it's not so hard to learn the differences. What you find is that the way in which people think about their work and so on, there's a lot in common across the arts, I think. It's not, I mean, the desire to make something, the desire to create, I think is what unites the arts. And the way you do it and which one you choose, that's a matter of temperament and sensibility. But the creative desire is what I think is in common between all the arts.
Yet one sort of asks questions about the worth, if you said, what's the worth of Indian art? Or you ask questions like that, you immediately start thinking visual arts.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think
some sort of hierarchy of the senses.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of worth is very dangerous because it leads you very rapidly to the marketplace. And I don't think that the marketplace is the best arbiter, I mean, we know in literature, the history of literature shows us that there are many, many very great writers whose work was not remotely popular in their lifetime. It doesn't affect the greatness of their work as it's come down to us. We know from the history of art that Van Gogh sold one painting. That when William Blake made Songs of Innocence an experience, I think in his lifetime, something like 3 copies of the book were sold. And yet these are artists who have defined a kind of Western tradition. So the market is not the best arbiter.
I think I'm sort of headed toward also thinking about, even in the age of mechanical reproduction, I mean, you can acquire a Rushdie in a way that you can't quite acquire Bhupen Kakkar or Bhagat Sundaram.
No. Well, that's the big difference of painting is that there is one painting. But I mean, let's say artists, of course, make other work which exists in series, etchings, prints, etc. But it's true that the extraordinary thing about the oil painting or the sculpture is that it's a unique work. It's one thing. And that, of course, is very different from text, which
can be more demotic, though. It can be shared more.
I suppose, I mean, just that's what there is. But I think in India, there's been always a great interest in both these arts. That's always been a culture in which visual arts have had a big place, and in which poetry, philosophy, literature, has also had a big place. So. Whether people are as interested as they used to be, I'm not sure. And certainly people are more censorious than they used to be. I mean, we live in in India, it's beginning to be very worrying. the way in which the arts are now subject to attack.
That's great. I was going to ask you about what threatens art in India
Religion.
today most.
Religion. No question. And it's not one religion, it's all of them. There's in fact a kind of competitive thing going on where, you know, if Muslims attack A, then Hindus have to attack B, then Sikhs have to attack C. It's a kind of escalating competition of offendedness. And it's actually very alarming. You know, that I mean, as we know, this case of Hussain Saab, who was actually forced into exile, and not only was he forced into exile, but so was much of his work. And the idea that that body of work will now be housed in a museum in the Gulf somewhere, you know, which clearly belongs to the, it belongs to Indian art, you know, and yet has been exiled from it, and that's a tragedy, I think. But it's not just him. I mean, there was, you know, just in the last month there was an attack on a gay artist in Delhi who had done some nude paintings of, I don't know, Madhuri Dixit or whatever. You know, it's always Madhuri Dixit. I don't know why.
She commands attention.
What can I tell you?
Yeah.
I think it may not. I'm just making that up. It may not have been her. It was three movie stars that he had, you know, just imaginatively represented in an unclothed fashion, and a bunch of hooligans broke into the studio and attacked the art and beat him up. If you look at the number of attacks there have been, I mean, if you look at the attack on James Lane's book of Shivaji, on Ramanujan's essay about the 300 Ramayans, on on Hussein's work, I mean, occasionally on my work, but it's there is an increasing assault on culture in India from religious extremists of all kinds. And what makes it worse is the fact that the authorities almost always side against the artists. And blame the artists for making trouble.
In the name of communal harmony.
In the name of communal harmony. It's the artist's fault that people have become violent. It's the fault of the victim of the violence for stirring up the violence. You know, that's kind of now normal. And what I think is even worse than that is I think there's beginning to be a broad public acceptance in India of the idea that it is better not to offend religious sensibilities than to have free speech. You know, that it is better to create a censored environment in which religions of all kinds fail to be offended than it is to have a world of free expression. There's beginning to be a lot of acceptance of that idea. And I think that, if it goes on like that, will cripple the arts in India.
So people will censor themselves.
Yeah, people will. Or you know, it won't be shown. It won't be published. It won't be exhibited. It won't be, you know, certain kinds of films. I mean, you know, Shah Rukh Khan got into trouble because he made some innocent remark about Pakistani cricketers. And so there are attacks everywhere, every week right now. You know, and it seems as if those people who wish to impose fairly extreme conservative views of religion upon India have understood that culture is the soft target, and that by was instituting this phase of culture wars, you can make your point more effectively and more economically, more efficiently than in other ways. So oddly, the arts have become a target in India, and what makes it worse is the unwillingness of the intelligentsia, of, you know, the educated classes to say, no, this is rubbish, we have to stand up against this. And instead a kind of acceptance of censorship by offense. You know? And if this goes on, it will be very bad for the arts in India, because it will make it very difficult for artists to do what they want to do.
And or they'll move out.
Yeah.
So it's not just lacking a sense of tolerance, it's also lacking a sense of history.
Yeah.
Because I remember in 2007, you delivered a wonderful lecture on the composite artist, and that was about the production, the 16th century production of the Hamza Nama under the reign of Akbar. And that was an attempt to try to talk about the Indian tradition as diverse and hybrid.
Yeah, not
and
just that,
multiply
there you have Hindu and
informed.
Muslim artists working on the same canvas, working on the same picture, literally, doing different bits of it. And it struck me that when Hussain was being accused of pornography because he had painted Saraswati without any clothes on, I thought, could you just show me the pictures of Saraswati with clothes on? Where are those to be found? Hindu gods on the whole don't wear a lot of clothes. They wear a lot of jewelry, they're very adorned, but the idea of actual garments, I don't think Saraswati's wardrobe would take up, the space on this table. So the point was not that he was painting Saraswati in the nude, because Saraswati has always been painted in the nude. It's that it was a Muslim artist painting Saraswati in the nude. That was the sort of undercurrent of that. It's a Muslim insulting Hindus. That's why we must attack it. Whereas, you go to, I don't know what, Elephanta, you go to the National Museum in Delhi, you look at the sculptures of the gods. There they are with, as I say, plenty of jewelry, but there's no shortage of nudity. So it's an ignorance of your own tradition. That you already have a tradition of the nude portrayal of the deities, of the female deities. And that's been so for thousands of years. And why suddenly do we have to, put them in parda?
It's a Victorian
Parda being a Muslim idea. Why do we have to put Hindu goddesses in bags?
Yeah, it's a good point. Can you talk about the popular arts just for a little bit? You've just come away from the Penn New England Awards, where you can tell us more about it. This is recognition for song lyrics and major musicians.
Yeah.
And we could take that conversation into India, but maybe you could tell us about
this was just
this venture.
Well, I just felt, many of us involved with Penn have felt for some time that we need to broaden the concept of what literature is, and that we have lived in a generation in which extraordinary writing has been done in the field of song lyrics. And we can all name those people from Bob Dylan to onwards, but Penn New England finally instituted this award for song lyrics. It's called Song Lyrics of Literary Excellence, and the first two honorees were Leonard Cohen and Chuck Berry. And it was I had this extraordinary afternoon where I had to present an award to Leonard Cohen, and Paul Simon had to present an award to Chuck Berry, and Elvis Costello came and played some music, and Keith Richards showed up and eventually got up and grabbed a guitar as well. So it was, it was a nice Sunday afternoon. But it was a recognition of the fact that if you look at the best of this work, obviously a lot of song lyrics are garbage. I don't think we're going to be giving any awards to, Dadu Ron Ron, for example. But at the best of it, there's writing being done of great quality. You could, if you think of the judges for this award were very remarkable. The panel of most of the panel of judges would have deserved the award, as we had Smokey Robinson, Roseanne Cash, Paul Simon, Bono, Elvis Costello, Paul Muldoon, and me. With the exception of baby Paul Muldoon and me, the others certainly had very strong claims to winning such an award. And then there's McCartney, there's Bowie, there's David Byrne, there's a lot of people that Elton John,
Awesome.
There's a lot of people that you can think of who would be worthy of it. Carole King, lots of people.
So can you see this translating into the Bollywood
Well,
song lyric?
it's before Bollywood, isn't it? There's the period of...
because we've had some of our best poets
The
have
poets, what
written
I'm
for cinema.
That's what I'm saying. Now you have Javed Akhtar and so on, but even before that, if you think about the age of the great Urdu poets of Faiz and Josh and so on, that Zahir and that these ghazals were being set to music and quite regularly and often very popular. So that idea of poetry and song being related is a very ancient idea. You know, and for example, in the European myth of Orpheus, Orpheus is not just the greatest singer, but also the greatest poet. You know, and that in the figure of Orpheus, the arts of song and poetry are united, and of course poetry was in its origin always in oral form. And in India still very much often is in oral form. You know, so I think that close relationship between poetry and song, and particular forms like the ghazal, which lend themselves to musical adaptation very easily, has always been there in India. And yes, I mean, now you have people like Javed, you know, who's obviously very skilled at film music as well.
Speaking of which, you've got a film coming out.
Yeah, but no songs.
Oh, no songs.
Well, there's, I mean, no new song, no kind of nach gana, none of that. Nobody dancing on railway stations at the end.
Oh, you can always add that in later.
No. I think Slumdog it isn't.
Midnight's Children is due to be released at some point.
In the fall. I mean, it's almost finished. It's not quite finished. We have to. I mean, it's finished in the sense that it's shot and it's cut, but we are still putting some effects into it, and some of the music isn't finished yet, and is arriving gradually. I mean, there's a score, and there are one or two places where people sing, but there's one point where somebody actually sings a Faiz Ghazal, because you know Salim's sister in the novel grows up to be supposed to be a famous singer, and so there's a point where she performs, and the famous Pehli Si Mohabbat Ghazal, she sings in this film at one point, and there's a couple of places where people sing folk songs, or traditional songs, or snatches of them, but there's no actual item numbers.
We'll just have to enact our own.
Professors Bahri and Rushdie have agreed to take questions from the audience as well, and to continue the conversation in that way. And I, as moderator, let me follow up on this question about film. As you've moved from the genre of primarily writing fiction to right now writing memoir and also screenplays, right? And a television series as well. Is that correct?
Well, we'll see. It's in development.
So, does that involve a different part of your own artistry? Do you find the film process to require a different set of skills than that of a novelist?
I mean, yes. So it's every form, needs somewhat different set of tools. I mean, one of the big differences. We were talking about this at a session I was at yesterday. One of the big differences between movies and books is the question of interiority. I mean, Midnight's Children is a first-person narrative, and a lot of it exists inside the mind of the narrator. As a film, you can't be inside the mind of the narrator in that way. Film is exterior, and so you have to find actions that express the interior self, rather than in a novel where you can do it directly. So it's a different way of telling a story. It's telling a story from the outside rather than from the inside. And if you do it right, then the audience feels that they know what's happening inside the character. But the technique of doing it is quite other. When you can say "I," and then talk about what that "I" feels at any given moment, when it's happy, when it's sad, when it's frightened, when it's excited, etc. It's straightforward in a novel. In a film, the rule of show don't tell becomes very important. You can't actually tell people in a film. You have to show them.
Is this something you had to experiment with yourself?
No, I've spent my life watching movies. I'm a Bombay boy. I mean, I grew up in the movies.
Right.
I grew up surrounded by movies. I mean, you grew up in Bombay. You grew up drenched in movies, and I have always been very, kind of a student of the cinema and kind of very interested in it. I mean, I always have said that when I was at university, there was this little cinema in Cambridge then, which is, now it's a coffee shop, But the arts cinema in Cambridge, which was where they would show, essentially they would show the great, I mean, there was a great moment of the world cinema, that period of from the late 50s to the early 70s, the so-called French New Wave, the Italian New Wave, you know, and the world cinema of that period. And it was, I felt I got as much of an education in the arts cinema as in the university library, you know. And it's hard now to tell people what it was like when these films, which are now considered to be the classics of the cinema, were that week's new movie. You know, when 1 week you had Fellini's 8½, and the next week you had a Godard movie, and the next week a Truffaut movie, and the next week, you know, a Kurosawa movie, and the next week a Satyajit Ray movie, and you know, it was just an extraordinary moment. Like, you know, Buñuel movie, an Ingmar Bergman movie, the extraordinary number of great filmmakers all working at the same time at that time was exhilarating to somebody who was interested in the cinema.
Right,
and I've always felt I learned a lot from it, you know. And so for me to start writing screenplays, I mean, I think the only way you write a screenplay, really, is you close your eyes and watch the movie, and then you write it down. You know.
Dictated to you.
And then, well, you just have, you know, you have to see it. That's the difference. It's not a question of writing dialogue, you know. It's a question of seeing the scene.
The visual.
And the dialogue then happens then. You know, first you have to see it.
Other questions from the audience?
So how would you view Deepa Mehta's interpretation of Midnight's Children? I don't know the amount of contribution you've had as, you know, in the movie making process. I assume that you've been.
Yeah, no, I've been very, so if the film's no good, it's my fault too. You know, and that's to say, we've been very, very closely involved from the first moment to now, you know. It's not been a traditional writer-director separation. You know, we cast it together. You know, we actually were both involved in designing the look of it. You know, I mean, I would produce old family photographs so that people could see how people dressed in Bombay in the 1950s and 60s. And we literally put together every aspect of the film jointly. I mean, in the end, only one person says action and cut, you know, so she very much, she shot it, and Deepa has a very particular gift at working with actors, you know, and I think the performances in the film that she's achieved are really very remarkable. I mean, everybody in the film has, you know, just gave it like 200%, you know, and the cinematography, and Giles Nutchins, who she has worked with before, who's a cinematographer, English cinematographer, who shot Water also, has made, you know, our relatively modest budget look like we had $100 million, you know, which if only we had. And then maybe there'd be some change. But as it is, it was very, very difficult to make what, obviously, the thing about Midnight's Children is that it's sometimes it's very big and sometimes it's very intimate, you know, and that, to try and find that, the rhythm of filmmaking which allows you to go from the epic to the intimate scale, you know, it was one of the great achievements of the cinematographer. I think he's very, very good at that. And it looks extraordinary, you know, and the performances are extraordinary. And now, I mean, cutting a film is a nightmare, you know. I mean, it's a friend of mine who worked with Francis Coppola for a long time said that if you had seen the first cut of The Godfather, you would have been horrified. Like it looked like a cheap B-movie Dagster flick, you know. And they worked on cutting it for a year. And at the end of the year, they have masterpiece. You know, so there is that thing that happens in montage, you know, which is another kind of movie magic. And took a long time to cut this too. Francis Coppola's advice to filmmakers, he said, no film is ever as good as the rushes, and no film is ever as bad as the first rough cut. And so that's, you know, you have to go towards the film, and it's a matter of tiny little things. It's a matter of rhythm and pacing, and there's a kind of music in editing, which when you get it right, when you get it right, the film, the storytelling just drags you through the story, and the audience isn't hiccuping and stopping, losing attention, and so on. So it was, you know, I mean, it was really hairy, but in the end, I think I like the cut that we have. So, yeah, I mean, I'm completely implicated in it, you know. So.
You said something the other night about your renewed respect for filmmakers of any film.
Yeah, it's true. You know, when you've gone through this kind of process the last 3 years or so of, you know, raising the money and making the film and so on, and you realize how difficult it is to get a feature film made. You know, I mean, assuming you're not in the big studio system, I mean, this, for independent films. It really gave me real respect for people who make any film, no matter how, you know, Porky's 12, I don't care. You know? Animal House 73, I don't care. You know, I think, you know, you made your movie. Congratulations, you got a movie out. It's in the theaters. You know, wow. Because I think you begin to see how many ways there are for that to go wrong and not happen. You know, well, we're not in the theaters yet. But we're getting there.
A couple of questions, Ben.
Yes, question. We're talking about, you've been a great writer, love reading you. The novel, if you can comment on where it's going in the future with the coming of the ebooks, and people moving away from the actual hard copies, and there needing to be that interaction with the reader where you could do different things. You also put multimedia maybe in there. Where do you see that art going, and where do you see that progressing in your eyes as a writer?
Well, there's two slightly different questions. One is what's happening imaginatively in say, Indian literature, and the other is what are the consequences of these technical innovations. I mean, my own view is I don't care how people read as long as they're reading. You know, I mean, if they're downloading ebooks and reading them, fine by me. You know, I mean, it's not reading that's the problem. And I mean, I think there's an argument that ebooks increase the number of people who are actually willing to read. You know, people who never go into bookstores, but who are willing to click a button and download. You know, so it's whether it'll end up destroying bookstores or not. I mean, there's an argument that it will. I hope that's not true. I mean, the parallel of the record industry is a salutary one because it did destroy record stores, the new technology. And I hope that isn't what happens, but I mean, I don't know. But in terms of actual reading habits, I mean, I like reading on an iPad, you know.
What does it do to the art?
Well, I don't think it necessarily does anything to the art. I think what's happening in Indian literature is in these multiple generations, I've just talked about Indian literature in English, it's very interesting to me because of how much the writing has diversified. You know, that's to say, if you look at the generation before myself, you know, you have a group of very fine writers, you know, Narayan, Mulkrajanan, you know, Raja Rao, all those people, Anita Desai, even you could put in that group, whose work was, I mean, it's very different from each other, but they had in common a kind of classicism of language. And what's happened since is an explosion into many different kinds of language, really much more interesting and complicated and comic, surrealist use of language, which is no longer a kind of Forstierian language. So in a way, to create an Indian English which is not English, you know, and I think that's being done now by a very large number of writers very successfully. I also think what's interesting is that as more and more of this, you know, there seems to be a new Indian writer pop up every 5 minutes now, you know, and that has created a kind of spectrum of work, which I think one of the signs of a healthy literature is that there's literature of every kind. That, you know, if at one end is Chetan Bhagat, but at the other end is good writing.
Thank you.
But the fact that you can have everything from very kind of almost Mandarin writing of the kind of Amit Chaudhry kind, you know, at one end, and the pulp fiction of someone like him, like Bhagat at the other end, it's a good thing that there should be that very big spectrum, that there should be all kinds of writing. There should be thriller writers and science fiction writers and romantic love story writers and literary fiction and pulp fiction and etc. You want the literature to have diversity and richness, and in now I think that has happened in Indian literature, that you have this very large spectrum of kinds of writing, I mean, obviously the level of talent of the writers is up and down. Some are great, some are pretty good, some are not so good, and that's just a normal literary scene. I think what India now has, which it's never had until now in English anyway, is a really rich and diverse normal literary scene in which all kinds of voices speak in all kinds of ways. And that's, I think, a very healthy development. And I think on top of that, many people have said, but I think it's true, the arrival of very interesting contemporary Pakistani writing is a new development really in the last 10 years. When all the time that there was this kind of explosion of Indian writing in English, very little of interest was coming out of Pakistan for a long time. And now suddenly there's a whole generation of youngish writers in Muhammad Hanif and Kamala Shamsi and Nadeem Aslam and Daniel Muinuddin and 2 or 3 others. There's suddenly a lot of very talented young Pakistani writers who more than giving the Indian writers a run for their money, and that's good too.
Yes, sorry.
What of the rise of the graphic novel?
Well, yeah, what of it? I mean, one of the most humbling experiences is to do a book signing next to Neil Gaiman. I mean, I'm used to there being quite a lot of people who want my book signed, so there's a line, and you have Neil Gaiman's line going like around the block, because of Sandman and all of that. I mean, it's very popular. And somebody asked me the other day if I wanted to have one of my books adapted into a graphic novel. I said, yes, please. I mean, I'm interested in it, I mean, I grew up reading comic books. I mean, I was, at least a little bit of my mind was shaped by Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman and all of that. And so I'm pretty broad-minded about what can be done. And if the best of these novels, graphic novels, I mean, like Sandman, like Dark Knight Returns, one of them, V for Vendetta, not the movie. They're interesting. And I mean, I don't think really it's particularly for me, because it's not my inclination really. I mean, I'm too interested in language and words on a page, really, and I think I always will be. But I mean, I'm interested that it's there. I mean, I think you always have to be, I think, as interested in the development of new forms, because there are always going to be new forms, and to say that they shouldn't be there is just dumb. The question is what can be done with those new forms, I think with graphic novels we're only at the beginning of knowing that. There are some, like for example Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis, which I think of as a kind of masterpiece. Art Spiegelman's Mouse. There are people who have managed to use the form to create genuine art, I think. And then there's a certain amount of junk, but there's always a certain amount of junk. Junk is the price of having the form at all. Most novels are junk. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have novels.
There's a question in the back.
Will you be directing your own movie soon?
Will I be directing a movie? Nobody's asked me. No, I don't have are you asking me?
I make movies.
No, I mean, well, I'm not exactly that, but one of the things that's interesting about, I mean, I'm developing a TV series for Showtime Network right now, and one of the things about the form of the 60-minute drama series as it's now developed in this country is that it's very much a writer's medium. That if you look at these series, The Sopranos was David Chase's show. He was the writer. The Mad Men is Matthew Weiner's show. He's the writer. 6 Feet Under was Alan Ball's show, etc. So there are these shows Deadwood was David Milch's show, so on. You have the ability as a writer to be the primary creative voice in a movie project, and you hire the directors as the writer. You have a writer, it's me and the showrunner, and in some cases when the writers are more experienced, they can be the showrunner too. I've never done it, so I probably need somebody there to do that job. But if you're doing 12 episodes, you can't have the same director for all 12 episodes. It's just not technically possible. So you have to have like 4 directors doing 3 episodes each, and the writer and the showrunner run the show. So it's an interesting reversal of priorities from the film industry, in which the writer is very much not the primary creative force. So that's, it's not directing a film, but it's a way of, for me, to be making film work with a serious amount, I hope, of creative control. So if it comes off, you'll have to tell me what you think.
The reason I asked, because 2 of my friends acted in the film Midnight Children in Sri Lanka. They came to Sri Lanka, Salman Rushdie and Ambika. They found you are quite interesting to listen to you than the Deepa. That's what they told me.
I'm not going to say anything about that.
Question over here.
Thank you very much for coming to this session here at Emory. I have some investors who are interested in investing in art in India. Who would you recommend some artists that are not as well known right now, but will increase in value over the next 5 years?
I'm not doing that. I think that you just have to do your homework. But I would suggest that you look at that middle generation, the generation that's between the Hussain Raza Gaitonde generation and the current Subodh Gupta, etc. generation. In between that, you have a very large number of interesting artists. Some of them I was mentioning, Bhupen Khakar, Arpita Singh, Dhruva Mistry, Nalini Manani, Nirama Sheikh, Ghulam Sheikh, Lakshman Gaud, a whole lot of people, and you should have a look over there, because I think in some ways that's an undervalued generation. In the way that the international art market of long ago managed to put the prices of people like Hussain and Raza and Gaitonde up high, and now ditto even higher with the younger gang. In the middle, I think there's more interesting work, and they're not cheaper too. So, but you can maybe push their prices up. Yeah.
Hi, you talked about pressure, religious pressure on art in India, but what about political pressure? Because with your novel, did you face any with the novel The Moor's Last Sigh because of Raman Fielding's character being a little more like Bal Thackeray, and how did you deal with that?
There was just, there was a bit of, it wasn't that much actually, there was a little bit. It wasn't ever Bal Thackeray himself, but somebody, what happens is that the middle-ranking people in the Shiv Sena, I think they can please the boss, by taking umbrage at something that, Bal Thackeray himself never said anything about it. And what happens?
Ban it though in Bombay.
No, what happens is in India they don't do anything as crude as banning it. They make a customs order which makes it hard to import it. It's all done through the customs system. It's the same with the Satanic Verses. The Satanic Verses is not banned in India. There's only a customs ban. It's a sneaky. It's this. We are like that only. But what happened was that there was an attempt to prevent it from entry under customs regulations. And in those days, now it would be easier in many ways because the Western publishers have their own Indian companies. So now there's Random House India, But in those days there wasn't, and so you had to have a local publisher. In that case was Rupa, who would bring out the book locally. Now to get the ban lifted, you have to have an Indian company going to the court and taking what's called a show cause motion. Now you have to ask the government to show cause why their business is being interfered with. The point about a show cause motion is it gets in the courts right away. You don't have the normal delays of the Indian law. But it has to be an Indian company that does it. Foreign companies can't do it. So we had to persuade Rupa to take the action, and they were initially a little scared because they're going up against the government and blah, blah. But eventually they did do it, and the day they lodged the show cause motion, the government backed down. It never actually got to the court at all. And ever since then, the book's been freely available in India. So there was just a little moment of glitch. Now we're talking, I mean, I don't know, we should, in my view, we should challenge the customs ban on the satanic verses, which in many ways is ridiculous now because you can download it. You know, I mean, if you go to Amazon and ask for it to be delivered to your Kindle, they will deliver it. You know, so anybody in India can buy the satanic verses as an ebook, which makes it ridiculous that you can't import a hard copy. You know, so we'll see. There's wheels turning in this regard. I think, you know, after 23 years, almost 24 years, it's probably okay to ask to get rid of this ridiculous ban.
And there was a marathon reading from Satanic Verses at the Jaipur Literary Festival.
No, it wasn't a marathon reading. It was 4 different people reading little bits. And the Jaipur Festival behaved very badly towards them, but that's another story.
You have a question over here?
I don't know if you can comment on this, but in the U.S., there's a group of Indian writers with medical backgrounds who become very popular.
Yeah.
Which is unusual elsewhere. You don't know. I don't think there's anything like that in the UK or India, but like in the US, there's Abraham Verghese, Siddharth Mukherjee, Atul Gawande. Can you comment on that phenomenon?
They're all very good. As well, I say they're all very good indeed. You know, I mean, I read Siddharth Mukherjee's book quite recently, and it's very impressive. And Abraham Verghese, I've been reading him. They both published that he and Atul Gawande both published in the New Yorker, and I mean, they're really. I mean, who knew that doctors could write? I mean, given my handwriting, it's difficult enough to read. But it's impressive. There have been, in the history of literature, some medical people who have written books. I've tried to think there are some great writers who were medical persons, but I'm blanking right now. It's not very common.
I think we have time for one more question.
In olden days, the kings and emperors encouraged artists to bring their art into the mainstream. Do you see now, in these days of democratic process, do you see Bollywood and other film industries bringing the artists in the mainstream?
I don't think so. You know, those days of patronage of the, say, like we were saying, of the Mughal court and so on, you know, were very remarkable. I mean, that desire to bring the greatest artists to the court, the poets, the musicians, the painters, etc. And that was something which was one of the glories of the Mughal period in India. I think Bollywood, frankly, as it's now called, I mean, it's a relatively recent term. You know, when I was growing up in Bombay, the movies weren't called Bollywood movies. You know. I think it's declined. I think actually the artistic quality of those films is much lower than it was back in the, in the day. I mean, let's say in the films of the 50s, 60s, even early 70s, it seems to me were of much higher quality than the stuff that's pushed out now, which really appears to be, 6 music videos with a kind of stupid plot around them.
I ask because the talent people like you also are winning films, so
well,
maybe they are giving more economic.
I don't know. I think that there was a moment in India where there was an art cinema, there was a popular cinema, and in between there was this thing called middle cinema, in which all kinds of interesting work was done. You know, people like Chetan and so on, who were trying very hard to make a popular cinema which also had serious dimensions. Now, I think there is a sign of the rebirth of that cinema. You know, that leave aside Bollywood, never mind pure Bollywood movies. But I think because of the growth of the multiplexes and the growth of the urban film audience, there's now a place in India for films which don't have the item numbers, which are actually serious dramatic films. And I think there are signs that the quality of that cinema is rising again. And that's, I think, very encouraging. And, we have in New York now, there's this film festival of Indian films, and every year it seems to be that the quality of the films being shown increases. So And that's Indian cinema both from India and from here. It's a mixture of the two. But I think there is the optimism is in that middle cinema area, which is not the pure art cinema and is not the pure Bollywood cinema. But is an attempt to make a popular cinema that's also serious. And I think there is a rebirth of that.
We will have one more final question.
What do you think of the newer writers in India, like Chetan, Bhagat, Durjoy Datta, which their novels are bestsellers, but some of Durjoy Datta's newer novels are like their title, Of Course I Love You Till I Find Somebody Better. And these are bestseller novels. And it makes you sort of think that Chetan Bhagat was never born in the first place because he feels like so many Me Too writers were born out of this movement.
Well, let me be polite about Chetan Bhagat. His writing is very much aimed at a kind of almost like a young adult market, and as a result, the vocabulary is simple, and the plots are not that complex, and so on. And he's had a great success in reaching the audience he's aimed at, and that is the best you can say for him.
And may we quote you?
I don't think anybody mistakes it for literature, including him, by the way, including him. He's quite open about it. He says that he doesn't believe his writing is kind of like of high literary quality, but he's doing a particular thing, and he knows what he's aiming at, and he achieves his goal. So, the world of books is not entirely composed of art. There are many books which exist as books and have their place and have their readers and their audience, but you wouldn't mistake them for art. In the same way as the world of food contains a lot of food that is not haute cuisine. And all of us at some point want to eat a burger, but we don't mistake it for fine dining. And so Chetan Bhagat is the burger.
And with that inspirational note, I think we'll call this session to a close. We're grateful to all of you for being here in the audience. Grateful to you, Professor Bahri and Professor Rushdie, and of course, we love you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.